Well, thank you all for coming this afternoon, and I'm delighted to be here. My background is as a writer, and about 4 years ago I started a website called America Comes Alive, and the point was to find little-known stories of America's past and tell them in an interesting way. It's my 4th year of celebrating Women's History Month, and so over the course of those 4 years, I have found some really interesting women. And so today, I'm really glad to have put them in a category and be working on the ones who have made a difference in health and medicine. And I'm going to introduce you to 6 different women. 3 of them are doctors, 2 of them have had some sort of level of nursing training, and 1 of them is a dog trainer. But she made a huge difference in the health and wellness of Americans as well. So I think you'll enjoy getting to meet them and to run through a little bit about who we are going to meet. First of all, I want to introduce you to Lydia Estes Pinkham, and she is known for having made a vegetable tonic that was very helpful with female ills at a time when people really didn't talk much about menstrual problems or anything, and Lydia was behind all that. The second woman is one of the women that you probably will have definitely heard of, Clara Barton. She was known as Angel of the Battlefield, and she also started the American Red Cross, but I'm going to talk to you about something else very important that she did. We have Dr. Rebecca Lee Crumpler. She was the first African-American doctor in this country and a very important physician in her own time. We're also going to meet Dorothy Harrison Eustace, and she's the one that I mentioned as a dog trainer. And the reason that she's significant is because she is the person who trained the first seeing eye dogs. And when you hear that story, you'll understand how very important that contribution was. We're also going to meet Dr. Virginia Apgar. She created a newborn scoring system. And the final woman we're going to meet is Dr. Antonio Novello, who is the first woman to have become the U.S. Surgeon General, and she was Surgeon General under President Bush. So those are the women who are awaiting their introduction. But first, I have to give you some sort of a perspective so that you understand what medicine was like during the time that these women were functioning. Now, we're going to start, of course, with Lydia Pinkham. She lived in the mid-19th century, and medicine at that time, this is going to give you at least one picture of them, but medicine at that time was extraordinarily primitive. They hadn't a clue about cleanliness, and if you went to a doctor and were going to have some level of surgery, there was a 50-50 chance you were going to end up dying of an infection as a result of the surgery. And the main reason was cleanliness. Doctors didn't know to change clothes before they did surgery, and they didn't know to clean their utensils before they did surgery. So as a result, they were working in dirty clothing that had been exposed to germs, dealing with utensils that had been exposed to germs, and then they were performing surgery on you, and you were very likely to have ended up with an infection as a result of that. Now, also during this time, they had no powerful medicines. Antibiotics had not yet been created, so if something happened to you and you did get a serious infection, there was really nothing that could be done other than just waiting and seeing if time would heal all. We had sulfa drugs that finally showed up in the 1930s. Penicillin in the 1940s, so as you can see, if we're talking mid-19th century, we have a long time before we have powerful drugs. Okay, now we also think about pain relief during this time. Now, aspirin was a drug that had been around for quite some time, and our pain relief during these years would have been an aspirin, and we know that that's only modestly effective, or they had finally figured out the use of ether or chloroform for things like tooth removal, and you've heard of the Civil War soldiers having surgery under chloroform or ether. So for a major issue, they could use this very powerful drug, and otherwise you kind of had aspirin or a swig of alcohol. So understanding that medicine was very primitive at that time, we will go forward and kind of begin to understand a little bit more of these people. Now again, to give you an idea, we have this woman is a typical mid-19th century woman. We move to this group. They are more of a frontier group of friends, shows a little bit more casual clothing, but again, kind of the type of people who would have been needing health care at that time, a little bit more formally dressed. And we have a final picture here of a family grouping. of people who would have been alive at this time. So these would have been the kind of people looking for health solutions during Lydia's time. So we meet Lydia, 1819 to 1883. She lived in Lynn, Massachusetts, and these pictures are not of Lynn, but they were the best I could do to give you an idea of the rural community and the type of settlements a place like Lynn would have had. There would be some factories and that sort of thing, but still very early medicine. So we get to the fact that Lydia is a young woman. The one kind of profession that was open to women during that time was becoming a teacher. Lydia became a teacher. She got married in 1843. And just like all of her friends, don't we all compare notes on how we're feeling about different things? Well, if you had a health problem during this time, you would not have gone to a male doctor to discuss menstrual ills. That's just something that you wouldn't have done. And if you had something very serious and you did decide to discuss it with a doctor, he was very likely to attribute it to hysteria or deranged organs or a wandering womb. These were the kinds of concepts they had at that time. And if he should think that surgery was the right solution, I already talked to you about what the statistics were if you underwent surgery. So there wasn't a very good medically approved option in that case. So what do you think these people did during that time? If they had something bothering them or having serious cramps or something like that, how do you think that they might have looked for solutions for health problems? Any ideas? Exactly. And those two things were both used. They mixed up home remedies and they talked among themselves looking for solutions. So Lydia Pinkham was one, and she was one of many who came up with a concoction that she found that seemed to be helpful with her family. And it became well enough known in the community that people would start dropping by Lydia's house to see if she would mix up some for them. Lydia was a kind and generous woman, and she would dole this stuff out. And as a result, people came from far away to start getting this concoction because they had heard that it actually worked. Now, her vegetable compound had some contents in it that I'll read you. It contained unicorn root, life root, black cohosh, pleurisy root, fenugreek seed, and it was in a mixture of 19 to 20% alcohol. Now, there are a couple of significant things about these ingredients. One is that black cohosh is something that you still see on a lot of herbal ingredients in herbal products. We all know that the FDA does not test those things. When you go into a health food store, you may have heard that something is good, but there is no scientific proof of that. So it may work, and it may work just the way people believe it worked today, but it is one of those things that there is no science proving it. The 19 to 20% alcohol certainly would have had some effect, but you have to remember that this was a medicine, and it would have been doled out in 1 to 2 tablespoons at a time. So while a woman might have felt a little better by having a little bit of alcohol enter her system, it certainly wasn't intended for or used to get drunk. And that would have been very important to Lydia because Lydia was part of the temperance movement. So she did not believe in consuming alcohol at all in that sense. Okay, so Lydia's family is mixing up this brew in her kitchen on a regular basis. 1873 comes along, and the economy in the United States takes a nosedive. Her husband, Isaac, loses his job, and he must have been kind of a ne'er-do-well. He was arrested for indebtedness and kind of never became supporting in any way for the family. So the family was left on their own. Now, by this time, we have Lydia, and we have 4 more or less grown children. She had 1 daughter and 3 sons. And so Lydia and the children got together, and one of the sons said, "Mother, your medicine is so popular, we ought to package and try to sell it as a business." So the family decided to do that, and the way they distributed their work was that one daughter and 1 son took on jobs locally so that they could earn money for things like the bottles, and I have another example of another kind of product container they used, where they would spend the money on the containers, and they would also spend money on the contents that had to go into the medicine. And the other two would take sales routes in major cities in order to try to sell this medicine. Now, important to this product was the fact that for the first time in packaging, the packaging actually expressed the fact that it was for female ills and menstrual difficulties and uterine pain. And this was new in the field of medicine. Nobody had ever come forward and said that a medicine was going to help with these things that everybody knows existed, but nobody would talk about. So those things were different. So they spend the first year with two of the sons covering New York and Boston. They regather that summer, and it's been a bad year for sales. A few things have sold, but things aren't going well. So Daniel says, you know, we really have got to take our last bit of money and see if advertising would work. And he had a very important idea, and it's something that affects advertising today. One was to take an image, this is an image of Lydia, and use her as the salesperson because she looks like somebody honest, trustworthy, and somebody who would not be out, you know, not selling you snake oil the way the medicine men were. She looked like an honest person. So they did that. And they also had all these local people talking about how very successful the medicine had been. And of course, we still use those in medical advertising today. So they got testimonials from the people who would use their product and use those to see if that would make a difference. Well, they did. And as a result, the next year, they began to see sales coming along. Now, by one of the latter years that they were going, they had $300,000 worth of sales one year. Now, that would have been, in that time, a very considerable sales result. And here are some of the different, that's a modern box of something that you can find today. But things were definitely moving along in that way. But something else important began to happen, and this is what I think is, to me, the most valuable thing that Lydia did for us. People started writing to Lydia with their medical problems. Again, they had nobody to talk to about female ills, so they wrote to Lydia. And Lydia did her best to answer every single letter. Now, again, the family was smart. They said, okay, people are writing in for this advice. We're going to package it so that there's a better way for them to get this information. So they had a book called Female Complaints. They had another one called Health Hints. And these were offered to people so that they had some access to information that they never would have had any other way. So it was truly a good thing. Now, of course, in the back of the books, there would be an ad for the product. So it was sort of a win-win situation. Now, we have one problem, though, which is that tuberculosis comes and two of the sons are killed or die from it in the 1880s. And a year later, Lydia has a heart attack and dies. So unfortunately, they were not around for all that long to benefit from the fruits of the business. A couple of the family members did keep the business going, and the business still exists today. It had to be the medicine had to be reformulated in 1927 in order to comply with the FDA, but it is a product you can still find. If you go on the internet now, you will have people talking about the fact that it can be helpful with fertility and all sorts of things. So there are still believers, again, not necessarily with scientific proof, but it is still out there. But when we look back at what Lydia did, I think the most important contribution she made was letting women talk about what was wrong with them. And the advice she always gave was, you know, she had no medical training, but she gave practical advice. She believed in exercise, loose clothing, balanced diet. So anything that she offered to them was always just good old mom's common sense in so many ways. And to show the effect that she had, there was even a ballad written about her, which is pretty good if you want to be famous. That sounds like a good thing going forward. Now we're going to move forward to somebody who was actually trained in the medical, or somewhat trained in the medical profession. She had at least had some nursing experience. Clara Barton, 1821 to 1912, is known as the Angel of the Battlefield, and she founded the American Red Cross. Those are her two main claims to fame. The third thing that she did was she ran an office of missing soldiers, and that's the point I want to be sure to talk to you about today. But to give you a little bit of fast history on how she got into the nursing aspect, Was the youngest of 5 children in Massachusetts, and her brother became very ill, and so when she was only 11 years old, she became the primary nurse for seeing him through what was a 2-year illness. And that's where she got her nursing experience. It wasn't through training under anybody, it was just through seeing someone who was very sick go through the process of getting better. So she starts at a very young age, doesn't pursue the nursing profession. What is she, of course? She becomes a teacher because that was what was open to her. She's a teacher in New Jersey for a period of time and then gets replaced by a man, goes to Washington, D.C. in the mid-1860s and gets a job as a clerk in the patent office. Now, in the 1860s, we have the beginning of the Civil War in 1865, and as Union soldiers were being injured, they were being brought back into Washington, D.C. And Clara Barton was observing these people being brought in, injured, and was very touched and moved by their circumstance. And some of them also happened to have been students of hers in New Jersey. So this was an even more compelling case to her. When she started visiting the sick, she realized they just didn't have enough supplies. So she quit her patent job and went out, started looking for the fact that they should find more supplies and gathering supplies that they needed, and then she would go and do nursing. Now, she continued that line of thought and realized that the people did not have access to anything on the battlefield either. So she started going from following the battle, and I've got a few Civil War nursing and battle shots and the ambulance trains of the Civil War. And then we get to a plaque which actually recognizes her presence at Antietam, or no, this is Manassas, and the fact that she was there offering supplies and offering nursing help. And so it was something that she really became known as Angel of the Battlefield because she was out there and helping them all along. So she started all that early, but I think that battlefield experience also very well put her in the position to begin to hear what was happening with the missing soldiers. She was out there, she was talking to the different soldiers, and after the war, she still stayed around and was doing nursing, and she was approached by a fellow who had been a prisoner at the, oh dear, we've got the founder of, okay. She had been, who had been a prisoner at Andersonville, which was a very unpleasant prison in Georgia, a Confederate prison, and there were a lot of Union soldiers there. Well, the job of this particular soldier had been keeping a record of all the Union soldiers who had been at Andersonville and had died during the time that they were there. He secretly made 2 lists. He kept one for the prison, and he kept one for himself. So when he was actually released at the end of the war, he left with 13,000 names of Union soldiers who had died at Andersonville. And of course, no one had let their families know. No one had written home to anyone about any of these prisoners. And he approached Clara Barton with this problem. She went with him. They went back to Andersonville. They located as many of the graves as they could. And she went back to Washington, D.C. with a mission. And she started the Office of Missing Soldiers. The Office of Missing Soldiers was open from about 1865 to 1868. And she, in order to identify the dead, she started running newspaper ads of the roles of the missing people. And she would also send notices over to local post offices. Like if they knew a certain regiment had been fighting in an area, they would notify that local, the town where that local regiment came from and get that list posted so that they could begin identifying, what had happened to people and where people were hurt and if people knew of the whereabouts of any of the other soldiers. So she made numerous efforts in order to reach out and find, the people that she could. And over the course of time at this Office of Missing Soldiers, she received over 63,000 letters. She tried to answer absolutely every one, and during the course of that time the office was open, they were able to identify over 22,000 soldiers. So a lot ended up being identified. Now, the important thing about that is that the only identity on most of those soldiers was if they had happened to write a note that that they were that they had on their person when they fell, and it might have been a letter that said, please send this letter to so-and-so if I don't make it, because they didn't have ID tags at that time. There was no identity of them. Now, a friend might have written and said, oh, I was fighting with Stephen at such and such a battle, and he was killed. I'm so sorry to inform the family of that. So there were some ways of letting people know, but not very good ones. But we also had something today with the internet and cell phones and that sort of thing. We wouldn't be able to do this as well. But some of the soldiers just plain didn't want to go home. You know, they thought about their home life, and they thought about the family they'd grown up in or the wife they'd left, and they thought, maybe I'll just go home with my buddy. And nobody ever heard from them again. So the role that Clara Barton filled in terms of helping identify these people and figure out who was dead and who was still alive was actually very important. Now, Clara Barton had a very important quote that I wanted to pull for you, because with all these people, they have recognized a problem, they have figured out a solution, and part of the way that they have figured out a solution has been that they have had a complete disregard of precedent, and she says it very well. I have an almost complete disregard of precedent and a faith in the possibility of something better. It irritates me to be told how things have always been done. I defy the tyranny of precedent. And I think that's so important for all of us to remember, because it's such a simple thing. We've got to remember that the way things have always been done is not necessarily any sort of solution to anything. We just need to keep looking for other and better answers, because there probably will be one. Now, to kind of finish up with Clara Barton and the Red Cross, American Red Cross was actually something that she founded after the Civil War in the 1870s. She had gone to Europe for a rest cure, but I don't think Clara Barton was capable of rest. So she's over in Europe and she observes the International Red Cross, and she decides to bring it to America. Well, nobody was too excited about that, because they said, well, we'll never have anything as awful as the Civil War again. Why would we need a Red Cross? And she said, you know, we really need something for disaster relief. And as we know today, the Red Cross is absolutely vital in disaster relief. I mean, for the terrible things that happen in our country, it is so wonderful to have an organization like that that swoops in and is organized to help. So she actually has left us a very long-lasting contribution and something to be remembered. Now, moving forward to Dr. Rebecca Lee Crumpler, there are no verifiable images of her from her time, and so unfortunately the best I can come up with is this sort of honorary thing that has been created of her, and probably what she looked like. But Rebecca Lee Crumpler had grown up in Pennsylvania, and she lived with an aunt, and that aunt was the person in the community where, if some, again, African Americans could not go to a white doctor, and so if something was bothering you, you might go to Rebecca's aunt and say, I've twisted my arm, or I have this very bad cut on my leg, and can you help me with it? And she would come up with some sort of a home remedy in order to make you feel better. And so Rebecca lived in this atmosphere of somebody actively working to help fellow man feeling better. And as a result, she felt it was very important to go into the, you know what, I've got a missing slide. Okay, to go into the helping services and to do something that she could. So in that day, there was no real formal way to train for nursing. And so what you did was you attached yourself to a doctor and kind of learned by being his assistant. She had the opportunity to work with a couple of different doctors, and they were so impressed by the work that she did that they recommended that she be allowed to go to the New England Female Medical College. Now, that would have been really something, that she is being recommended to train as a doctor, something that would have been very unusual for an African American at that day. Now, the year that she actually starts is 1860. Difficult time for our country, and it takes a while before she actually, and I have to skip forward on a slide here, that it would have been a very difficult time for our country, but she does eventually get her medical degree, and she sets up a practice in Boston. Now, She takes some time out to go to Virginia to help some of the people after the Civil War, but she comes back to Boston and sets up this practice. And of course, she's seeing people. This happens to be a group from Topeka, Kansas, but it was at least a correct era, more or less, and a mixed group. And these people would not have had access to medical care had they not had access to somebody like Rebecca Crumpler. But Rebecca goes forward and does something even more important. Oh, I've got this in the wrong order. Oh, okay, I think the other version had the slide that I needed. But she also decides when she's near retirement that she's going to write a book on medical discourse. So in the 1880s, she sits down and she writes about what it was like to be ill and what you needed to do if you were a female and how to take care of your family. She talks about issues concerning nursing. She does teething. She does bathing your newborn. She does infant colic and all sorts of these issues that had never been written before. She also is very big on preventive medicine, which of course we know is an important piece today. And to me, this is like the extension of Lydia Pinkham. Lydia Pinkham kind of got that conversation going, and as a mom type, she moved forward with this information. But Rebecca Crumpler comes and she codifies it by actually taking her medical experience and writing a book that has not been written before, a book aimed at women to offer medical advice in terms of taking care of their family. Something that's very important and something that certainly needed to be done. Now, when I normally give this speech, I come and I introduce Lillian Gilbreth. And she is actually a very important woman that some other time I'd love to tell you about, because she was one of the first people, and she and her husband were management consultants, efficiency experts. So it's a very interesting background that they would contribute to the health and well-being. But one of the things that Lillian did was she noticed that the effects of World War I were that for the first time America was having to deal with a great number of disabled people. And her contribution, and something that she and her husband worked on together, was creating a system so that the workplace and the home could function in a better way if people were disabled in some way. So it was a very important contribution that she made. But while I was thinking about her, I thought of something else that was going on at that time. And I thought of Dorothy Harrison Eustace, because she lived at the same era, and it was the World War I that was the wake-up call for her. And I thought, you know, she is such a special story that I would like to tell you that story instead, because it's something that you all are coming from all different walks of life and different backgrounds, and I thought it would be a story that you would long remember. Okay, Dorothy Harrison Eustace was a well-to-do woman, American woman. She married well, and she and her husband were well enough off that they were kind of experimentally farmers, and they were goofing around with cattle breeding, trying to breed the best cow that they could. So they're in the process of doing this, and unfortunately this husband dies. Dorothy is left with 2 children, and but yet she's gained this experience of understanding breeding. She remarries. She and the new husband and children move to Switzerland, and she is over there and starts dog training. She gets involved with the German Shepherd, which is primarily a dog that came over from Europe. She becomes part of a program where she is training police dogs for the Swiss police. And her program, and because she was a well-to-do woman, becomes well enough known in the United States that the Saturday Evening Post contacts her, excuse me, and asks her to please write an article about what she's doing in terms of training these dogs. So Dorothy thinks about this circumstance and thinks about something else that she's been observing. She's been observing the most amazing program in Germany, which is that after World War I, a great number of German soldiers had been affected by mustard gas. The mustard gas had caused them to lose their sight. So what the people in Germany were working with were these German Shepherd dogs to teach them to be guide dogs for these men who had lost their sight. And Dorothy thought that was a far more compelling program than the program that she was actually working on. So she goes over, she goes and visits that program and writes her article about that. It shows up in the Saturday Evening Post. the post is being read all over the United States, but by one particular father in Tennessee is reading it to his 26-year-old son who is sightless. And he reads him the article, and the son, by the name of Morris Frank, hears about it, and he says, "Father, I want one of those dogs." So the father and son write a letter to Dorothy and explain what their circumstance is. And they offer two things. One is a request and the other is an offer. The request is Morris wants to come over and be trained with one of the dogs. And the offer is that he will help her bring a class of those dogs back to the United States so they can be used by blind people in the United States. Because to understand this, it's important to understand if you were sightless at this era, now Morris Frank happened to be in a well-to-do family, so his solution could be that he could hire a young kid or hire a teenager to help lead him around when he had errands or things to do. But if you had no money, you had to hope a relative would be willing to take you around. So it was really a very sad, very desperate life, and you had absolutely no independence. So the promise of having a guide dog who could help you get around was absolutely so exciting to Morris that he couldn't wait to imagine what his life might be under those circumstances. So Dorothy sees the possibilities in that, invites Morris to come over. Morris is put him on board a ship to make the trip over to Europe, and because he is sightless, he is classified as a package. He is placed in a room. He has a stateroom, so he's treated like a normal passenger in that way, but he is forbidden from leaving his room unless a staff person has time to come and pick him up to see him someplace. It's sort of like when you put children in the package room at the airport because there's nobody to watch them when they're in between flights. It's the same sort of inhuman treatment. And that was what Morris had when he was being sent over to Europe. So that's how he gets to Europe. He meets up with Dorothy Eustace, and she begins the training program. Now, she has been working with two different dogs to prepare them to meet Morris because she didn't know, she wanted him to have a choice of which dog worked best with him. Well, the dog that worked best with Morris was a dog named Kiss. Now, Morris is 26 years old, and he thinks, I don't think I can go back to the United States with a dog named Kiss. So he renames the dog Buddy. And every single dog he had for the rest of his career was named Buddy. So Buddy 1, Buddy 2, Buddy 3, because he was young enough that he went through a good number of buddies over the course of that time. Okay, so Dorothy is going to send Morris back to the United States with the dog after a couple of months of training. She is going to stay back and finish training the dogs that she has underway that she's going to bring to the United States. And she takes Morris and puts him on shipboard with Buddy, and she has a very serious warning to him. And she says, Morris, Buddy will do you absolutely no good if you don't make him acceptable in restaurants and hotels and on modes of transportation. So this is your mission. Now, Morris heard her very seriously and understood that that was what his goal was in life. And to his credit, he spent the rest of his life making dogs acceptable throughout the United States. This particular story, Morris, the press knew that he was coming when he was arriving in the United States for the first time, and his very first effort at kind of coping with everything that was going to happen was getting off the ship, coming down the gangway, and having to cross West Street in New York City. Now, New York City in 1929 was not New York City in 2014, but it was still no quiet place. There were a few carts and wagons still around, there would have been cars, there would have been a lot of people, so there was a lot going on, and Morris is there thinking, I hope Buddy can navigate us across that street. So he gets to the street, and he gives Buddy the command. They get across, and they're on their way for what became a lifetime adventure for the two of them. Press gave it excellent coverage, and Dorothy eventually came over with the class of dogs. Morris fulfilled his obligation to Dorothy in terms of helping her set up a school and do additional training. And actually, with this particular buddy, he had one final goal. You know, he knew that this buddy was getting old after about 10 years, and that he was going to need to retire him and work with a new buddy. And his one final goal with that dog was that he wanted to make sure that he could fly on a commercial airplane with that dog in the passenger area. And I'm sure you've all been on planes, or you might have been on a plane when they bring a seeing eye dog on. I mean, it is not terribly common, but it does happen, and it is legally permissible. But he finally got one of the airlines to let him fly back to his home at this time in New Jersey, and with the buddy in the cabin of the plane with him. So that was a very significant moment of progress. And he and Dorothy, this is one of the training classes, and he and Dorothy went forward to start the Seeing Eye School, which still very much exists. They train dogs on a regular basis. And I actually have spoken to the director, and I asked them, are dogs totally acceptable now? And he said, you know, neither my wife nor I have sight. We both have guide dogs. And I will tell you that in New York City, trying to flag a cab when you have two guide dogs is almost impossible. So it's still one of those things that I don't think the way is 100% easy. He also said that guide dogs are more important than ever now because of hybrid cars, because he said a car at rest, or a car that looks like it is at rest, may not actually be at rest. So you need the dog there to help sense that there might be some sort of a danger. So Dorothy and Morris did a very wonderful thing, and when we see all these dogs on campus, I'm sure you've got service dogs, they're in the movie theaters, they're in restaurants, they're everywhere, and we have to be very thankful for the work that they did. Now, Virginia Apgar was a woman who became a doctor, and her medical education started in 1929, and she graduated in 1933. And of course, this is not a good time for getting a job as a doctor. And the doctors who are prepared for jobs are, and who really want the jobs, are the men. You know, why would a woman get a job as a doctor when all these men need to get jobs? So her mentor realized that Virginia Apgar was a very talented woman, and he suggested that she go into the field of anesthesia. Anesthesia was primarily supervised by nurses at that time, but the mentor did realize that there was a growth possibility to have in that field, and that having a doctor supervising it was probably a good idea. It also paid less than any of the other MD type of jobs. So Virginia Apgar wasn't exactly getting, she was getting an opportunity, but she was not exactly being well paid for the circumstances. So she goes into anesthesia, and a lot of her work ended up being an attendant during medical births. And to have some understanding about what happened during the birth process. You know, we've all heard of home births, and certainly during the late 1800s and early 1900s, home births were still very common, and, you know, midwives were there and that sort of thing. But as we get toward about 1940, we're beginning to see more and more hospital births. And with a hospital birth, of course, you have a doctor, and if you have a doctor, you're more likely to have the feeling of some sort of an active role on the part of the medical profession. And the medical profession decided that their role in the process of delivering babies had to do with offering a pain-free birth experience and safeguarding the health of the mother. So those are two very worthy, very important goals, but that was kind of where they drew the line. Now, in the process of being there, you know, we have, again, the hospital scene, we have the babies in the little bassinets, we have the mother being, you know, the babies being brought to the mother. I guess I don't want that one quite yet. And so we have Virginia Apgar in the operating room, kind of watching what's happening. You know, the babies are popped out, more or less, and they are sort of sent off, you know, to the nursery or wherever they're going. And some did well, and some didn't do well. And Virginia began to be concerned about that, and began to come up with the concept that there needed to be some way to evaluate the newborn right after birth, that they were actually a patient too. a subject the medical profession was totally missing out on. They were worried about the mother, and they were worried about no pain. So, and mothers weren't thinking about it because they were in twilight sleep because of the anesthesia that was being used. So they didn't have a clue what was happening to the baby when it was first born. So Virginia Apgar was someone who really enjoyed sharing her information with people, and the first time she ever codified what she believed in was a time when she was in the cafeteria, 1949, and a medical student stopped by her table and said, now remind me again what it is you look for when those babies are born. So she actually wrote down what it has now become, well, it was called then the newborn scoring chart, but is now known as the Apgar score. And she, at 1 minute and 5 minutes, she evaluates the heart rate, respiratory effort, muscle tone, is the baby moving around, reflex irritability, if you scratch the bottom of the foot, does the baby respond? And the color, does the baby show good color? Now, as you can see from this baby, the baby didn't score too well at 1 minute, but by 5 minutes, this baby's doing fine. Now, after Virginia Apgar had set this up, they've now decided 10 minutes is also another important time to take it. So the Apgar score is still used, but it's done at 1 minute, 5 minutes, and 10 minutes. She first wrote a medical paper on this in 1952, but as we know with anything, it takes a long time before anything gets accepted. So it was more like the late 1950s before all hospitals really had started implementing this system. But it was indeed a very important system because it prioritized which babies could go off to the nursery and nobody had to worry much about them, and which babies needed to have help right away because they were struggling. So it was such an important thing, and she was a huge contributor in that way. Now, like all these other women, Virginia Apgar did not rest with having just had one accomplishment. In 1959, she went back and got a degree in public health, and she went on to work for the March of Dimes. And of course, that was actually in a very related field because the March of Dimes is all about infant types of birth defects and that sort of thing. And so she was a big leader in vaccination of children and that and improvement of health. So she contributed on many levels. Now we have Dr. Antonia Novello. She was born in 1944 and is still living, actually still practicing in Florida. And she was born in Puerto Rico, and she was from a very poor family. Her father died when she was pretty young. Her mother was a teacher and a principal who was not able to live with the family because the school where she taught was far away. So Antonia was raised by other family members, and she had a long-term health problem. She had some sort of colon problem, and they had no money to deal with it and could not get her to a medical facility for any sort of treatment. So until she is 18 years old, she is living with this very difficult, painful disease. When she's 18, she has surgery number 1 to repair the colon, and it only was so mildly effective. And when she was 20, she had to have the repair done again. So finally, when she was 20 years old, she had something taken care of that could have been taken care of at a much earlier age. But this heightened her awareness. She did go on to become a full doctor. She moved to the United States and was practicing medicine. Her particular interests and expertise were, one of her family members had had an organ transplant, so she was very aware of the organ transplant issues. She was interested in public health and believed that AIDS, and saw the children who were particularly suffering because their mothers had AIDS. And she also campaigned against smoking and underage drinking, and was particularly on the case of the Joe Camel campaign that was going on during her time when she was Surgeon General, which was in the 1990s, and was able to get that banned. But overall, she led many important movements in terms of improving a lot of aspects of public health, and one of the overriding issues was that she very much wanted to bring more access to health care for people who were poor, because she went back to her own time and thought about what a difference it would have made if she had been able to be helped when she was still very young. So I think you can see with all of these women that they had a pattern in their lives. The first thing they did, of course, was they spotted a problem. something we can all do in so many aspects of our lives. After they spotted a problem, they ignored precedent. It didn't matter how the problem was being dealt with in the past. You have to look for new avenues. What's a new way to solve the problem? So you look for those new avenues of success, and then you keep trying and experimenting and using the final ingredient, and that is persistence. You just keep working and working and working until the problem is solved. Now, as a result, you can see that with all these women, they have not only solved a particular problem, but they have also laid the groundwork that other people have been able to build on their fields for the future. And we have so many wonderful health improvements that have come because of the things that these 6 women did. And that brings me to my conclusion of my formal remarks, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. I also have a sign-up sheet if anybody wants to sign up for my Women's History list of mailings that'll go out during this month. I also have a Women's History magazine that if you'd like to take, it's put out by the Women's History Fund. So do you have any questions about the people we've talked about or any topic you'd like to bring up? Yeah.
So Dr. Novello, her specialty, did she have, she specialized in public health, like as her practicing area?
She originally was a pediatrician, and because she had had so much experience with ill children and with her own self being ill, and she had to quit because she said, when the pediatrician cries more than the parents do, you know it's time to get out. So I think her patient care issue, she was so sensitive to them and felt so much, felt so deeply with the problems that she decided her more important role was in setting, a policy for public health. So she found that to be her most important contribution. Yeah, but you're right, she did have a first practice too. Yes?
You said the first CI dogs actually went to Germany? When they picked them up or trained them or something?
The first seeing eye dogs were being trained by Germans for German soldiers recovering from the mustard gas, or not recovering from the mustard gas. No, then Dorothy Eustace was training her dogs in Switzerland. She had gone up as a reporter to cover the story in Germany because she had heard about this program, but the program she was running was actually in Switzerland. So when Morris Frank came over, he met her in Vevey, Switzerland, and that was where they worked, because her training program was actually for police dogs, but then with this opportunity with Morris Frank, she took the opportunity to figure out how to train dogs for seeing eye dogs.
She was in Switzerland and training police dogs?
For the Swiss Army. And then she then came back to the United States. So yes, but she was American originally. She was American originally. I think she was a New Englander, and then she and her husband were running the cattle breeding in Pennsylvania, I believe. He dies, and yeah, it's kind of like the wealthy in those days were kind of like international citizens in the sense that they moved around in a way that I don't really think we have that same.
When did they set up a seeing eye dog school in the States?
In the States, it would have been the 1930s, because 1929 was when Morris Frank arrived with the first seeing eye dog, and then Dorothy came over in like 1930, 31, and they started some, what would have been informal training programs. And I'm not certain what the date of the actual starting of the Seeing Eye School was. I'm sure it's on their website, but it would have been within certainly within 10 years of that time that it was formalized, because Dorothy and Morris then dedicated all of their lives to making the seeing eye dogs. And I've actually done a lot of stories about the different types of training that different dogs are going through. With the service dogs, they're now using them for diabetic alert dogs. They have them trained for stability. They are using big Great Danes for people who are very likely to fall. And the Great Dane is not only trained to be there for stability for somebody who has an uneven gait or something, but the dog and the person learn a safe way for, if the person does fall, learn a safe way to get that person up off the ground. Because I guess if a bystander comes along and tries to lift a person incorrectly, it can actually hurt the person. So the dog and the person has a choreography of what to do. Another woman I interviewed had a dog that could actually help her move from wheelchair to bed, and then the dog could cover her at night because she was, she had very little movement from, the waist down. So these dogs are being trained to do amazing things. The PTSD dogs are there. They're using them a lot with the military and with men who have come back and have had PTSD. One story of a fellow I talked to, his dog was always with him, and if he was in a circumstance where he was clearly becoming anxious, the dog would signal him by pointing to the man's watch. And the man would then be reminded, and he would, this was a lie, but he would say, "Oh, excuse me, I have to leave to take my medicine." But it was the dog's signal to say, "I can tell you're getting anxious, you need to get out of this circumstance." So it would give him an opportunity to step away from whatever was making him anxious, and then he and the dog would recollect, and he would decide whether he could re-enter whatever the circumstance was. But it was a technique they developed so that it wasn't embarrassing that the dog's pulling on the guy's sleeve or trying to in some inappropriate way indicate that you need to move. So these dogs, and also I guess they're working with monkeys and that sort of thing. There are some amazing things going on in terms of what they're being able to do in terms of providing calmness and stability. And one of the issues they're dealing with is dogs in the workplace, and what do you do if people are allergic to dogs? So there are always problems that have to be solved, but it is an interesting field of pursuit. Any other questions? Yeah.
What advice do you have, as women entering a field, for example, science and technology that is predominantly male-dominated, and establishing rapport and respect, and potentially becoming someone like this in the future?
I think the most important thing to do is to persevere. Legally, everything is on your side. You absolutely can do it. And I think getting in there and showing that you can do it and that you're not going to be intimidated. I think there always is that old boy network of possibly not including you in a study group or something like that. And if there is that, you either need to address it, or you need to find a study group of your own, or whatever it is. But you need to just figure, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to be the best I can be, and it's all going to work out. And I think only by having women like you who are willing to go forward in those fields will we begin to see an overall change in dynamics. And the rewards will follow, both in terms of the improvement. I think all of these women contributed things that men would never think of contributing. So we really need female inventors. We need female inventors inventing the insides of cars and things like that. I mean, there's so many areas where we really could use that other viewpoint. So it's important to do it and just stick with it and figure you will succeed. Because in theory, the world is open to you, but in actual practice, there will be hurdles to overcome. Anything else? Well, thank you very much for coming. It has been a pleasure to prepare for this, and I really am delighted to be here in Phoenix, and thank you so much for having me.